I'm going to be covering a debate between Tucker Carlson and Chen about affirmative action from 2016.
A group of about 60 Asian organizations is suing Harvard University. They say that affirmative action hurts Asian students, and they have the numbers to prove it. According to a study by Princeton University, Asian applicants must score 140 points higher on the SAT than white students do, 270 points higher than black students do, and 450 points higher than African American students just to have the same shot at getting in. Is that fair? Joining us now is someone who thinks it is fair. Chen is a Harvard alum who supports affirmative action. He's part of a group that is fighting the lawsuit we just mentioned, and he joins us now live. Jay, thanks a lot for coming on. So my question is really simple. What would you say, and if you're a father, you may be in this position someday, what would you say to a kid applying to Harvard or any other elite school in the United States who doesn't get in because he is held to different and higher standards because of his skin color, and says to you, that's unfair, because of course it is? What would your response be?
Well, Tucker, I am a father, so this is a discussion about college admissions that I will have. But what I'll say is that, you know, the elite institutions, the acceptance rates are already so low. When I applied to Harvard, it was a 10% acceptance rate. Today, it's 5%.
How does Harvard having high standards justify racism?
Right.
And all of these schools, they take a holistic view. And race is never going to be the determining factor, whether or not you are going to get in. There are so many other aspects that they look at.
It's good that race isn't the determining factor, but the fact that it's a factor at all is still a problem and racist. To put this in terms the left will understand, an argument used to prove the existence of systemic racism is that if a white person and a black person are arrested for the same crime, the black person will receive a higher prison sentence than the white person. If we go by Jay's standard of racism that race has to be the determining factor, then black people receiving higher prison sentences than white people isn't racist because race isn't the determining factor in how long someone goes to jail. There are other factors the judge looks at. Now, I understand this isn't the best comparison because the racism Jay's defending, affirmative action, is overtly open about holding Asians to higher standards than other races, and the races I'm comparing it to, blacks getting higher prison sentences than whites for the same crime, is solely based on speculation, based on disproportionate results that may or may not be a result of race.
Let's say a white person and a black person committed the same crime, but only the black person got sent to prison. One might say, well, that's obviously white privilege. But if I told you that the white person had a better lawyer, that would be something rooted in economic privilege. The usual response that I get is, well, black people make less money on average because they lack opportunities. And I would actually argue that a lot of white people have been very accommodating with entertaining this idea of white privilege and lack of opportunities in this regard. So what opportunities, you may ask? Well, let me give you some examples. So how about white voice actors who step down from their role to allow black voice actors to take that role instead? Mainly when a white person is voicing a character that is illustrated as a black person, despite the literal definition that acting is to pretend to be something that you're not. Here's another example. Incentivize diversity quotas or affirmative action, where more qualified individuals could get passed up on an opportunity to make room for black people.
But I think the comparison gets my point across, which is what matters.
And furthermore, I would let my son know that we don't live in a colorblind society.
Okay, to be fair, I don't like it when people say, I'm colorblind, I don't see race. Because there are people who are actually colorblind. I understand what they're saying is they don't judge people by their race, but imagine how it would sound to a deaf person if someone tried to say they have thick skin by saying, I'm deaf, I don't hear insults. It probably wouldn't sound like anything to the deaf person, because they're deaf. Moving on to what Jay meant, the US isn't an entirely colorblind country. Unfortunately, there are still individual races. However, most people are colorblind, and the only law upholding systemic racism is affirmative action, the very thing he's defending.
You can't ignore centuries of discrimination, of racism, slavery, policies like the internment of Japanese Americans and the Chinese Exclusion Act, and expect that everyone's starting off at an equal spot in the race.
Even if systemic racism in the past, supposedly giving white people a head start, justified discriminating against white people, which it doesn't, Like Jay just admitted, Asians are also the victims of historical systemic racism. So even if historical racism justified discriminating against a group that historically benefited from it, how does that justify discriminating against Asians?
So racism is still here.
Obviously, racism is still here. It's called affirmative action. You're defending racism right now.
And this last election is demonstrative of that, where it was probably the most racially divisive election that ever occurred, and the president-elect was elected despite, or maybe because of, some racist rhetoric.
Trump's not racist.
And that
Really,
trickles right down to our schools.
I'm sorry. Let me just ask. You haven't answered the question, which is, if you're against racism and racial discrimination, why are you explicitly supporting a system that penalizes people for the color of their skin, which you are? How can you say you're against racism and still penalize people because they're the wrong race?
That wasn't the question you asked him, Tucker. You asked him what he'd say to an Asian who was discriminated against by affirmative action. His answer was stupid and racist, but he answered the question you asked.
Well, Tucker, the students who apply are not being penalized because of their race. The application process is entirely holistic. They look at a lot of different things. They look at test scores, but test scores aren't the one and only thing that matter in terms of college applications. They look at leadership. They look at extracurricular activities. So race is but one factor among many that are considered.
Looking at other things than test scores such as leadership and extracurricular activities is fine, but the fact that race is a factor that's being taken into account at all is a problem. Your argument can be used to justify giving black people higher prison sentences than white people for the same crime. There are more factors taken into account, like what crime someone did. Their age and how many times they've done the crime in the past are all taken into account. So race is just one factor among many that's considered.
Sure.
And I would also say that there are other advantages that come to, let's say, the white community. And there are other advantages that are conferred. For example, Harvard accepts 35% of Harvard's student body, they come from private schools, while only 10% of American students go to private schools. You can look at Harvard's admittance of Northeastern students, which comprise 40% of Harvard's population, but only 17% of America lives in the Northeast. And these are all advantages that white students will also benefit from.
That has nothing to do with race, and even if white people were being given a set of advantages based on their race, how does that justify discriminating against Asians?
No, but those are all non sequiturs, actually. Well, hold on, wait, no, I'm sorry. As a Harvard graduate, you recognize a non sequitur when you hear one. I mean, I wouldn't defend any of those things. I'm not here to advocate for them. You're here to advocate for discriminating on the basis of race. I'm not saying race is the only criterion taken into account by Harvard's admissions, but you can't tell me that a kid who has to score 540 points higher just because of his race, over which he has no control, it's an immutable characteristic, is not being discriminated against. And again, why is that fair?
What Tucker just did there is call out Jay for using a whataboutism argument. Basically, think about it like this. If you're in a debate with someone about Nazis being bad, and you bring up they killed a lot of people, if the person responds by saying, well, communists killed more people, that doesn't address your point. It's just trying to justify something bad by pointing out an example of something else that's bad. Stalin may have killed more people than Hitler, but that doesn't mean Hitler's off the hook. Similarly, the stuff that Jay mentioned may benefit more white people than affirmative action discriminates against, but that doesn't mean affirmative action's off the hook either. Again, the main victims of affirmative action when it comes to college admissions are Asians, so this argument that there are other things that advantage white people makes no sense.
Well, I think race adds a lot to a person's life experience.
Obviously, it will contribute to someone's life experience if they have to experience racist laws. For example, like Tucker pointed out, if an Asian kid has to score 540 points higher because of his race, that'll certainly be an incident where race affects someone's life experience. But the solution should be to end discriminatory laws like affirmative action, not use that as an excuse to keep affirmative action around.
I think, a student at my community college, Mount Sac, who has to worry about whether or not his parents are going to be deported because they came from Mexico, has a significantly different experience than a white student who doesn't have those worries.
That has literally nothing to do with his race, and everything to do with the fact that his parents came here illegally. Do you seriously think all Latinos in the US are illegal immigrants?
The final thing I want to address is the people who think that Donald Trump is going to deport all the Mexicans. First of all, he said illegal Mexicans, those who are here illegally. If you believe that all Mexicans are illegal, then you are fucking racist, and there's no way of getting around that.
African-American student who has to worry about whether or not he's going to be shot by a police officer for, wearing a hoodie or something else. These are experiences that are deeply ingrained with race that not everyone has to experience.
Police do get in a disproportionate number of incidents with black people per capita, but that's not because we live in a systemically racist country where police are hunting down black people. It's because black people commit the most crime per capita. Even if the Trump administration was trying to round up and deport all the Latinos, and the police were a bunch of racists hunting down and killing black people, that doesn't justify keeping Asians on the list of racial groups the US is systematically discriminating against. The goal should be to get every group off that list, not use the fact that blacks and Latinos are on that list to justify keeping Asians on the list.
And it impacts them negatively.
But Asian American students are disproportionately poorer, disproportionately likely to come from public schools, disproportionately immigrants, the marginalized communities you say you speak for, and yet 540-point deficit penalty on the SAT? I mean, you're punishing the weakest, actually.
Well, actually, affirmative action benefits Asian American students. I know many graduates of Harvard who say that they are beneficiaries of affirmative action, and in fact, within the Asian American rubric, you raise a very good point. We have Hmong, Laotian, we have Pacific Islanders who regularly come from communities that are far more impoverished than even Latino or African American communities, and affirmative action actually will help them. So affirmative action does benefit Asian American communities because it recognizes that the Asian American experience is not all the same.
Even if affirmative action takes into account different ethnicities in a racial group, judging people by their race, or in this case, ethnicity, is still racist. I'll concede that taking ethnicity into account instead of generalizing everyone of the same race as the same isn't as bad as generalizing all Asians as the same. But that's a really low bar.
Okay, but that's all gobbledygook. When it comes right down to it, Harvard has a quota system for Asians, and you'll deny it because it's unconstitutional, it's illegal.
You shouldn't put words into your opponent's mouth, Tucker. Besides, Jay already admitted he thinks the Trump administration and the police are systematically discriminating against Latinos and blacks, which is unconstitutional. So I doubt Jay's going to use the fact that a quota system is unconstitutional to disprove that Harvard has a quota system.
But it's really clear that they do. For all races. They have, for example, last year, 11.8% of their applicants were African American, 11.8% were Hispanic. That number has remained the same. It's about 20% Asian. That has remained roughly the same over 20 years as the population of college-age Asian applicants has doubled. So there's no argument, no reasonable argument against the fact that they have a quota system as they did against Jews in the 20s.
Maybe we should listen to Jay's arguments before dismissing them as unreasonable.
And you're defending that.
Well,
Why?
Tucker, they don't have a quota system. First of all, it is unconstitutional.
What the heck? I can't believe Jay's actually arguing the straw man Tucker just created.
But secondly, when I was at Harvard, the percentage of Asian Americans was about 16 to 17%. Today it's 21%. So it's actually increased by 30% just since the time that I graduated. So it can't possibly be a quota system unless the quota numbers are changing, and then it can't be a quota system.
Unless the applicant pool has doubled, which it has. It's doubled. And that number has not doubled, as you know. And by the way, the numbers for other racial groups have remained constant because there is a quota system. Everybody's aware of it.
Except Jay.
Let me read you a quote from a man who does this for a living. His name is Brian Taylor. He runs a business that helps Asian students get into elite colleges. He said this to the Boston Globe last year. He said, "We will make them, the Asian applicants, appear less Asian when they apply." Now, why would he do that? He does that because colleges don't want too many Asians. And you know this really well. And yet you're defending it. I don't understand that at all. They're discriminating against Asians. They're open about it. Everybody knows it.
Except people like Jay who don't know how racism works and thinks in order for something to be racist, race has to be the determining factor.
And yet that's okay because why?
Well, like I said, there isn't a quota system because the numbers have actually increased.
Tucker already explained that the increase in students isn't proportional to the increase in applications, you moron!
And I believe they've actually increased for
Not proportional
Latino
to the
and
increase in
African-American students
applications.
as well.
No, actually
you're
they haven't.
right about that, but You know, Tucker, that is a whole nother segment worth exploring about this arms race of parents trying to get their kids into schools and applying to far more colleges now than they did before. So the population has not doubled, but the number of applications that are being sent out has. And colleges like this because it boosts their numbers, makes them seem more selective.
That's actually, let me correct you there. The population has grown dramatically, and when you add the international applicants, it's not just people pushing Harvard on the Common App. It's people who are qualified to go to Harvard with 800 SAT scores and straight A's and head of student council who are not getting in because of their race. Now, I mean, you haven't addressed this, though. If college counselors are counseling their students to pretend they're not Asian, and they do this for a living, they have no incentive to lie about it, you've got discrimination going on. And you're pretending it's not there for some weird ideological reason. And what is that weird ideological reason exactly? Because racism has taken place in America in years past?
I think these are anecdotal. I certainly put down that I was Asian when I applied to Harvard. I got in. As a Harvard admissions interviewer, most of the students that I've interviewed who have gotten in have been Asian. So, you know, from my own personal experience, I haven't seen that.
Those Asians who got in were still held to higher standards than their non-Asian counterparts. So from your personal experience, you've absolutely seen that. What you saw wasn't Asians weren't being discriminated against. What you saw was Asians getting in despite being discriminated against. If Asians get into Harvard despite being held to a higher standard than other racial groups, good for them for overcoming discrimination. However, that doesn't change the fact that holding a racial group to higher standards than other racial groups is racial discrimination.
But I think the reason why some people might do that is because there is so much divisiveness where people are being told that, okay, if you are Asian, you're being discriminated against, and there are consultants who will make money off of, you know, the desire of parents to give their children the best opportunity to get into college. And,
it's the parents'
and maybe they believe that will heighten their chances. But I don't think it will.
So telling a racial group they're being discriminated against is bad?
A student at my community college, Mount Sac, who has to worry about whether or not his parents are going to be deported because they came from Mexico, has a significantly different experience than a white student who doesn't have those worries. African-American student who has to worry about whether or not he's going to be shot by a police officer for wearing a hoodie or something else.
I already hear you saying, that's different. And you know what? You're absolutely right. The examples of systemic racism Jay brought up are due to things unrelated to race, like illegal immigration or the statistical reality of what happens when one racial group commits a disproportionate amount of crime. Affirmative action, on the other hand, is overtly open about penalizing people because of their race. So yeah, I agree. Jay saying Latinos and blacks are being systemically discriminated against is in no way comparable to saying Asians are. One claim is backed up by reality, the other one is blatantly false. I'll let you guess which one's which. Interestingly enough, Jay's example of a student from Mount Sac who has to worry about his parents being deported because they came here illegally is also anecdotal. But anecdotal evidence of systemic racism is fine when it's the personal life experience of one random student, and the issue has absolutely nothing to do with race. But anecdotal evidence is bad when you're listening to experts like college counselors.
Well, really, because when Princeton University, in a study that I think we both accept is real, says that you need to score 540 points higher than other students in order to have the same chance of getting in, I think it's a rational conclusion to believe that there's discrimination going on. Let me ask you one last question. You noted a bunch of painful periods of American history. Both of us abhor them. So the Japanese internment, slavery, Jim Crow, we all agree those were bad. Why are they bad? They're bad because they're examples of people in power hurting American citizens based on their race. How is that different from what Harvard is doing?
Well, Tucker, a lot of people will say that affirmative action in which African-American and Latino students who are given admission over Asian students who have higher scores, they say that that's reverse discrimination.
There is no such thing as reverse discrimination. It's all just discrimination. In order for something to fall under the definition of reverse discrimination, in the way the term is defined, it has to be specifically discriminating against a historically dominant group, such as white people or men.
So then, what do we say about the 60% of white students at Harvard who also are getting into Harvard despite having significantly lower scores than Asians.
You think affirmative action is justified because it discriminates against Asians in favor of whites? How should I put this? You're a white supremacist. I'm not joking. His argument seriously, affirmative action is justified because it discriminates against Asians in favor of whites.
That's bad.
No,
I mean, I'm not here to defend that. I believe in the meritocracy. I asked you a simple question.
So
is it okay to discriminate
why are we
against people on
focusing
the basis of their race?
22% versus the 60%?
Imagine you have two siblings, Ben and Rex. Ben has to get a C on his report card to be allowed to watch TV. Rex has to get a B and you have to get an A. The fact you're held to a higher standard than both of them is bad. But since the disproportionate standards you and Ben are being held to is greater than the disproportionate standards you and Rex are being held to, it makes sense you would focus more on Ben being held to a lower standard than you would focus on Rex. But that doesn't make the fact Rex is being held to a lower standard okay. You know what? You want to focus on affirmative action discriminating against Asians in favor of whites? Fine, let's do that. Like Tucker mentioned at the beginning of this segment, according to a study from Princeton University, Asians have to score 140 points higher than white students. How is that fair?
Well, because the numbers are so... I'll tell you exactly why. Because it is the hardest position to be in as an Asian student of all categories.
Every category? I thought you said affirmative action helped Asians, Jay.
We have Hmong, Laotian, we have Pacific Islanders who regularly come from communities that are far more impoverished than even Latino or African American communities, and affirmative action actually will help them. So affirmative action does benefit Asian American communities because it recognizes that the Asian American experience is not all the same.
But it still holds all of us to higher standards than every other race.
If you are an Asian girl, it's harder to get into these colleges than if you're anyone else.
Wow. I didn't realize affirmative action is sexist. What's your defense for this one, Chen? We can't just ignore the historical discrimination men faced in this historically matriarchal society. I'm joking. Obviously, Jay's actual reason's going to be, we can't just ignore the head start white people have. Therefore, we need to discriminate against Asians, especially Asian girls.
And so, we're picking the worst example. I could pick many examples.
Those were good points, Tucker, but they have nothing to do with the question Jay asked.
But my question remains the same, which is it okay to discriminate on the basis of race? I was raised to believe it's not. You apparently think it is. Is it?
Jay spent this entire debate justifying discriminating based on race. I don't care what he answers. His answer is absolutely yes.
No, I think that we have to recognize that we don't live in a vacuum, and that racial discrimination still exists.
Obviously, racial discrimination still exists. That's what affirmative action is.
And that we have to account for the fact that some people have a head start. And if you're going to advocate for a race-neutral policy, you're basically reinforcing the head start that some people already have.
Wait,
and
so you're saying
action is imperfect, but you know it's needed. It's part of the solution.
So the solution is to discriminate against a racial group that was historically victimized by systemic racism, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment camps, and redlining. Yes, I said redlining. Blacks aren't the only victims of that.
Is it racial discrimination to not let somebody into college based on his race? Can we just agree on that? Is it?
If that is the sole criteria that someone is not admitted into a college, then there would be something wrong with that, but that's just not the way that colleges work. They are not admitting students based solely on race. There are other factors that are involved.
If race is the sole criteria for why someone goes to jail, that would be a problem. But that's just not the way the justice system works. It's not arresting people solely based on race. There are other factors that are involved.
And, you know, I've talked about a lot of others that have benefited people, such as legacy, such as whether or not you went to a private school, if you're from the Northeast, and there are a lot of advantages.
Those are non
that
sequiturs. I mean, you're diverting from the question.
Not only is he diverting from the question, but the things he's diverting to have nothing to do with race.
And it's just, and you know that you don't have an answer to this. But if racial discrimination is wrong, and I believe it is, then it's just wrong. I mean, there's a moral element here, I think, right?
I agree that racial discrimination is wrong.
Which is why I spent this entire debate trying to justify it.
But to say that you're starting off from a clean slate as an applicant when, if you are a Mexican-American student and you're worried that your parents might get deported by the next president, you have a significantly different experience than
you know what?
Caucasian
Can I
students.
say something really clear?
White people aren't allowed to come here illegally either. But even if they were, that's irrelevant. The debate you're in is about whether it's okay to discriminate against Asians.
Children are not responsible for the sins of previous ages, okay? No 18-year-old Asian or Black or Hispanic kid is responsible for slavery or Jim Crow or the sins of America. I'm sorry. And to punish them for those things is grotesque. You would agree with that, right?
I would agree with that, but then why do bad things seem to happen disproportionately to these races that were subjected to racism in the past?
Just to go over the 3 examples that exist in this debate, more Latinos are deported because Mexico is a Latino country, and Mexico is an underdeveloped country right next to the US border. So it makes sense that most illegal immigrants we deport are Latino. Blacks get into confrontations with the police at a higher rate per capita because they commit more crime per capita. And Asians get discriminated against by college admissions because of racists like you who support affirmative action.
You want to say that racism doesn't exist?
That's a straw man of Tucker's and my position. Obviously, we're not saying racism doesn't exist. We're saying affirmative action is racist.
But,
well, of course I'm not. I'm saying that you're committing racism is what I'm saying.
Is because, African Americans are being, killed, even if they're not armed.
People of every race get killed.
This boy's life mattered. You probably have no idea who he is and won't recognize his name when I tell you it. But I'm sure if I flashed up these pictures, you'd be able to tell me all of their names, when they died, and who killed them. So why isn't Cannon Hinnant, a 5-year-old boy who was shot in the head and killed while riding his bike this week, receiving the same attention that criminals like George Floyd and Michael Brown did? Where are all the protests? Where are all the marches? And where is the national outrage? There is none, and the reason is very simple. Because Cannon was white and his killer was Black. Therefore, his life isn't important to Democrats, and it's racist to even report on this.
Take, for example, the case of 19-year-old Antione Watson, who thought it was a good idea to run across the street and shove an 84-year-old man into a garage door, killing him. Not only did Watson kill this 84-year-old Asian man for no discernible reason whatsoever on video, but it's important that you guys also know that he has the support of his grandmother and his community in these trying times for him. His grandmother says she just wants him to walk free and she loves him so much, this elder abuser who killed a man on his morning walk for no reason.
I mean, this is something that's
I wouldn't disagree with you. I'm
race-based.
just saying the answer is not more racism.
Exactly. I'm being discriminated against, therefore my racism is justified, is not only the mindset of these racial bigots who support affirmative action, but it's also the mindset of pretty much every racist group.
Do you know how racists recruit? For their clans, for their gangs, they convince people that they are getting a raw deal. Wrongfully so, by the way, for a long time, most of the time, based on race. They convince a lot of young white people that they are getting a raw deal because of their whiteness. And guess what? When you tell people, young people, you're not going to be allowed in because of your whiteness or because of your Asianness, you are justifying the recruitment patterns that racists use themselves.
For example, the alt-right.
I interviewed Jared Taylor, and I'm sure a lot of people know who this is. He literally said the left is doing everything in their power to make the alt-right grow. They are the ones who are they're setting the dichotomy. Right, what we're going to talk about is race. And by the way, white people don't get to speak.
What about the personal responsibility of the alt-right? Do they not have no personal responsibility to not be racist?
Yeah, absolutely. I disagree with them.
Oh, okay.
But the problem is, you're being racist, and that's making people think, well, it's okay to be racist. I'm a white person, I'll join the white interest group.
Oh, so they're forced to join this white interest group.
They feel like that, though,
Oh,
yes.
they feel like that. But don't they have a responsibility to not be racist?
Yeah, sure, but you're the ones being racist. You're setting the table.
Thanks for watching. If you liked that video, be sure to click like and subscribe. Links to the original video and the videos I showed clips of in this video will be down below in the description. And if you disagree with anything I've said, leave your wrong opinions down below in the comments. Bye.